The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, but Eleanor Whitmore felt no warmth from its rays. She stood at the communal well, her weathered bucket waiting to be filled, while the other women of the town formed a tight circle that deliberately excluded her, their bonnets tilted together like conspirators. And though they spoke in hushed tones, Eleanor knew with painful certainty that she was the subject of their whispers. 2 years now, Mrs. Harrington murmured, her voice carrying just enough for Eleanor to hear. 2 years since poor Thomas passed, and still she lingers here like a specter. The Lord's judgment is clear, added Mrs. Fletcher, clutching her Bible to her chest. A woman who cannot bear children has no purpose in a Christian home. It's unnatural, I say. Eleanor's hands trembled as she lowered her bucket into the well. The rope burned against her palms, but the sting was nothing compared to the raw ache in her chest. She had grown accustomed to these cuts, these 1,000 small cruelties that bled her spirit dry. Yet each one still found its mark. The women moved away as she approached, gathering their skirts as if her condition might be contagious. Eleanor lifted her chin, a habit born of desperate pride, and walked past them with measured steps. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her stumble. The walk back to her small cabin on the edge of town felt endless. Children playing in the street paused their games to stare, some bold enough to chant the cruel rhyme that had become her shadow. Barren Eleanor, hollow as a gourd, couldn't give her husband what the good book scored. She quickened her pace, water sloshing from her bucket, leaving a dark trail in the dust. The cabin, once a home filled with Thomas's laughter and their shared dreams, now stood as a monument to her failures. The mortgage papers on her kitchen table served as a daily reminder that even this last refuge would soon be taken from her. Inside, Eleanor set down her bucket and sank into the rickety chair by the window. The sampler on the wall, stitched by her own mother years ago, proclaimed, "Children are a heritage from the Lord." The words seemed to mock her now, each carefully formed letter a testament to what she could never provide. She had been 20 when she married Thomas Whitmore, a kind man with gentle hands and dreams of building a prosperous ranch. For 3 years, they had tried for children. She remembered the hope that bloomed with each passing month, only to be crushed by familiar disappointment. The local doctor, after numerous examinations, had delivered his verdict with clinical detachment. Some women simply aren't built for motherhood. Mrs. Whitmore. Thomas had held her that night as she wept, whispering that she was enough, that their love was enough. But she had seen the longing in his eyes when he watched other men's children, the way his face would cloud when another birth was announced in town, when the fever took him 2 winters past. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed him in life, as surely as she had failed to save him in death. Now, the town's patience with her presence had worn thin. A widow without children, without family, without even the excuse of youth. She was an anomaly that disrupted their tidy understanding of a woman's place in the world. The previous Sunday, Reverend Morrison had delivered a sermon on the virtues of fruitful marriage, his eyes finding hers repeatedly throughout his thunderous discourse. A woman's glory, he had proclaimed, lies in her ability to nurture and multiply God's flock. The congregation had murmured their amens while Eleanor sat frozen in the back pew, feeling the weight of their judgment pressed down upon her like stones. Even the men of the town, who had once tipped their hats to the schoolteacher's pretty wife, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and something darker. She had caught their conversations at the general store, debates about what should be done with the Whitmore woman. Ain't natural for a woman to live alone, Jake Sullivan had said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. Especially one who can't even fulfill her womanly duties. Maybe she could work as a laundress, another suggested. Or perhaps old Murphy needs someone to clean his saloon. The implications in their tone made her skin crawl. A woman without a man's protection, without children to validate her existence, was fair game for whatever the town deemed appropriate. Eleanor rose from her chair and walked to the small mirror above her washstand. The face that looked back at her still held traces of beauty. High cheekbones, eyes the color of prairie grass, hair that gleamed auburn in the light. But grief and ostracism had etched lines around her mouth and shadows beneath her eyes. At 28, she looked closer to 35. "You are still a person of worth," she whispered to her reflection, trying to summon the conviction Thomas had always shown. But the words felt hollow, like prayers sent into an empty sky. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor's stomach clenched as she recognized the heavy tread on her porch. Mr. Crawford, the bank manager, had been making increasingly frequent visits. Mrs. Whitmore," he said when she opened the door. His thin lips stretched in what might have been intended as a sympathetic smile. "I trust you've had time to consider our previous discussion." "I need more time," Eleanor began, but he was already shaking his head. "Time is a luxury neither of us possesses. The bank has been more than patient, but without payment. We must proceed with the foreclosure. However," he paused, his pale eyes traveling over her form in a way that made her clutch her shawl tighter. "There may be other arrangements we could discuss. A woman of your circumstances might find certain opportunities in town." The meaning behind his words was clear, and Eleanor felt bile rise in her throat. "I would rather die than accept such opportunities, Mr. Crawford." His face hardened. "Then you have 1 week to vacate the premises. Good day, Mrs. Whitmore." As his footsteps faded, Eleanor closed the door and leaned against it, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. 1 week, in 1 week, she would have nothing, no home, no position, no place in the world that had already deemed her worthless. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the prairie, Eleanor sat on her porch and watched the town prepare for night. Families gathered around dinner tables. Children's laughter carried on the wind, and the warm glow of oil lamps painted pictures of belonging in every window but hers. She thought of her mother, dead these 10 years, who had always said that a woman's strength was measured by her ability to endure. But what happened when endurance itself became a burden? When existence was reduced to a daily negotiation with shame? The stars emerged one by one, cold and distant in the vast western sky. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, feeling smaller than she ever had, a speck of unwanted humanity in a world that had no use for a barren woman. Tomorrow, she would have to face the town again, would have to endure their stares and whispers as news of her impending eviction spread. But tonight, in the darkness that cloaked her shame, she allowed herself the luxury of tears, not for what she had lost, but for what she had never been able to give, and for the person she was told she could never truly be. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting silver light through the bare window of Eleanor's cabin. She sat on the floor, surrounded by the few possessions she had managed to pack: Thomas's Bible, her mother's china teacup, a small daguerreotype of her wedding day. Everything else would be left behind when the bank claimed the property tomorrow. But it was not tomorrow that filled her with dread. It was what would come after. The letter lay before her on the rough wooden floor. Its words burned into her memory. Mr. Crawford had slipped it under her door that afternoon, the final insult to her dignity. The town council, in what they termed Christian charity, had arranged for her to be included in the monthly auction. Not the livestock auction, though the distinction seemed negligible. The human auction, where those deemed burdens on society could be bid upon for labor. "For your own benefit," the letter stated. "As a woman without means requires protection and purpose." Eleanor's hands shook as she folded the letter and placed it with her other papers. She had heard of such auctions in other frontier towns. Desperate measures for desperate times. Widows, orphans, those who couldn't pay their debts. They stood upon the platform while townsfolk bid for their services. Indentured servitude dressed in the clothes of charity. She rose and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. In the distance, she could see the lights of town, each one representing a family, a home, a place of belonging. Tomorrow, she would stand before them all, exposed and diminished, while they decided her worth in dollars and cents. The irony was not lost on her. They had already judged her worthless as a woman, and now they would put a price on what remained. Eleanor moved to her bed and knelt beside it, clasping her hands as she had done every night since childhood. But tonight, the words would not come. What prayer could she offer? What plea could reach heaven from a woman already deemed cursed? "Lord," she finally whispered, her voice cracking, "if there is any mercy left for me in this world, let it find me tomorrow, not for comfort, not even for kindness, just for the strength to endure what must be endured." She remained on her knees until they ached, listening to the prairie wind rattle the windows. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled, lonely and defiant. Eleanor understood the sound. It was the cry of a creature that didn't belong, that survived on the margins of a world that would rather see it gone. Rising stiffly, she walked to the small trunk that held her clothing. Her fingers traced the fabric of her best dress, a deep blue wool that Thomas had bought for her birthday 3 years ago. She had worn it to church, to town socials, to every gathering where she had still been welcome. Tomorrow, it would serve as her auction attire, one last pretense of dignity. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back seemed a stranger, hollow-eyed, sharp-boned, aged beyond her years. She touched her face, wondering if anyone would even bid for such a creature. The thought that they might not was almost worse than the thought that they would. Unable to sleep, she lit a candle and sat at the small table where she and Thomas had shared so many meals. Her fingers found the grooves in the wood where his knife had slipped countless times, cutting his meat with the same careful precision he brought to everything. She could almost see him there, his kind eyes crinkling as he laughed at something she'd said. "What would you have me do, Thomas?" she whispered to the empty chair. "How do I bear this shame?" But Thomas was gone, and with him, the last person who had seen her as more than her empty womb. The candle burned lower as Eleanor pulled out a sheet of paper and her pen. If tomorrow was to be her last night of freedom, for what else could you call belonging to yourself? She would leave some record of who she had been. "My name is Eleanor Marie Whitmore," she wrote, her hand steady despite everything. "I was born Eleanor Marie Harrison in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the year 1872. I came west with my parents when I was 15, full of dreams about the frontier. I married Thomas Whitmore at 20 and loved him every day of our 8 years together. I taught Sunday school and baked pies for church socials. I nursed Mrs. Patterson through her final illness and helped deliver Mary Sullivan's twins when the doctor couldn't come." She paused, the pen hovering over the paper. What else was there to say? That she had failed in the one duty society deemed essential? That her body had betrayed not only her husband's dreams, but her own? "I am still worthy," she wrote finally, the words blurring through her tears. "I am still worthy of love, of respect, of basic human dignity, though the world tells me otherwise. Though tomorrow I stand upon that platform like livestock, I am still a child of God. I am still—" The pen dropped from her fingers as sobs overtook her. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. All the strength she had hoarded, all the pride she had clung to, it crumbled in the face of tomorrow's humiliation. When the tears finally subsided, Eleanor looked at what she had written. The words, "I am still worthy," seemed to mock her, a desperate claim with no foundation. She crumpled the paper and threw it into the dying fire, watching her last testament turn to ash. The night wore on, marked by the steady tick of Thomas's pocket watch on the mantel. Eleanor dozed fitfully in her chair, starting awake each time with the sick certainty of what awaited her. In her dreams, she stood naked before the entire town while they called out her deficiencies like an auctioneer's chant. Barren, worthless, What good is a woman who cannot bear? As the first pale light of dawn crept across the prairie, Eleanor rose and began her final preparations. She heated water and bathed carefully, braided her hair with trembling fingers, and donned the blue dress. Each action felt like a ritual, a preparation for sacrifice. She packed her few belongings into a cloth bag, leaving anything too heavy or cumbersome behind. Whatever her fate, she would likely be walking to it. The daguerreotype of her wedding day she tucked into her bodice, close to her heart, one memory they could not take from her. As the sun climbed higher, Eleanor took one last look around the cabin. Despite everything, it had been home. The walls had heard her laughter and her tears, had sheltered her grief and her fleeting moments of peace. Now they would shelter someone else, someone worthy of a home. She stepped onto the porch and locked the door, placing the key under the mat for Mr. Crawford to find. The walk to town stretched before her, each step carrying her closer to her fate. The morning air was cool and sweet with the scent of prairie grass, indifferent to her suffering. Eleanor squared her shoulders and began to walk. Whatever awaited her at that auction platform, whatever degradation the good people of Cedar Ridge had planned, she would meet it standing upright. She had nothing left but her dignity, and even that would likely be stripped away before the sun reached its zenith. But for now, in these last moments of belonging to herself, Eleanor Whitmore walked with her head high, a condemned woman approaching her scaffold with all the grace she could muster. The town grew larger with each step, and with it, the certainty that her life as she had known it was about to end. "I am still worthy," she whispered one more time, though the words felt as insubstantial as morning mist. In a few hours, the town would determine her worth in the most literal sense, and Eleanor, who had already been found wanting in every way that mattered, could only wonder what price they would place on a broken, barren woman who had nothing left to give. The auction platform stood in the center of Cedar Ridge's main square, a rough wooden structure usually reserved for livestock and farm equipment. Today, it bore a different burden. Eleanor stood upon it, her blue dress a spot of dignity against the weathered boards, while the townspeople gathered below like carrion birds circling a dying animal. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, and Eleanor could feel perspiration gathering at the nape of her neck. She kept her eyes fixed on a point just above the crowd's heads, refusing to meet the gazes of people she had once called neighbors. She could hear their voices, though, a low murmur of speculation and judgment that rose and fell like a toxic tide. Mr. Crawford stepped onto the platform, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. He cleared his throat importantly, savoring his role as master of ceremonies. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his reedy voice carrying across the square, "we gather today in the spirit of Christian charity to provide opportunity for those who cannot provide for themselves." Eleanor's jaw tightened at the words. Charity. As if there were anything charitable about displaying her like a prize heifer. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. Crawford continued. Widow of the late Thomas Whitmore. Seeks employment and lodging. She is educated, can read and write, and has experience in household management. "Can't manage to produce children, though," someone called from the crowd, triggering a ripple of cruel laughter. Crawford held up his hand for silence. "Bidding will commence at $1 per month for her services. Who will start?" The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt each second stretch like an eternity, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Below her, she could see Mrs. Harrington whispering to Mrs. Fletcher, their faces animated with righteous satisfaction. Jake Sullivan stood with a group of men near the saloon, passing a flask between them and making comments that sent them into fits of coarse laughter. 50 cents! Finally, a voice called out. Eleanor's stomach dropped as she recognized Hiram Garrett, the owner of the town's seediest boarding house. His establishment was known for providing more than just rooms, and the look in his eyes as he surveyed her made Eleanor's skin crawl. 50 cents from Mr. Garrett, Crawford acknowledged. Do I hear 75? She can't give sons, another voice shouted. What good is a woman who can't breed? Maybe she's good for other things, Garrett responded, his leer unmistakable. More laughter, darker this time. Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to run, to flee this platform and this town and never look back. But where would she go? She had no money, no family, nowhere that would welcome a barren widow. 75 cents. This from Walter Murphy, the saloon owner. I could use someone to clean the floors, long as she don't expect special treatment. The bidding continued in this vein, each offer accompanied by insults and speculation about her worth. Eleanor stood statue still, trying to disappear inside herself, to find some quiet place where their words couldn't reach. She thought of Thomas, of his gentle hands and kind voice, and tried to imagine what he would say if he could see her now. $2, Garrett called out, apparently tired of the game. Final offer. She'll earn her keep one way or another. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. She knew what Garrett intended, what earning her keep would mean in his establishment. The crowd knew too, and their excitement was palpable. This was better than a hanging, public humiliation with the promise of ongoing degradation. Crawford raised his gavel. $2 for Mr. Garrett. Going once. $10. The voice cut through the crowd's chatter like a blade, deep, resonant, and utterly calm. Every head turned toward the speaker, and a collective gasp rippled through the square. At the edge of the crowd stood a man Eleanor had never seen before, tall and broad-shouldered, with skin burnished by sun and wind, black hair worn longer than was fashionable, and eyes dark as midnight. His clothing marked him as different, a mix of frontier practical and native influence, beaded leather vest over a cotton shirt, worn boots that had seen many miles. $10, he repeated, stepping forward. The crowd parted before him like water, some from respect, most from fear. Eleanor heard someone whisper, "That's the Comanche, the one with all them kids." "Joseph Tahu," another added, "lives out by Willow Creek. His wife died last winter." Crawford's face had gone pale. "Mr. Tahu, this auction is for—" "I know what it's for." Tahu's voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath the calm. $10 per month. My bid stands. The square erupted in whispers. A Comanche bidding on a white woman? It was unprecedented, scandalous. Eleanor saw the town's matrons clutching their shawls, the men's hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. "Now see here," Garrett sputtered, his face red with indignation. "You can't just—" "The auction is open to all, is it not?" Tahu addressed Crawford directly. "Or does your Christian charity extend only to certain bidders?" Crawford swallowed hard, caught between the town's prejudice and the legal technicalities of the auction. $10 was 5 times the highest bid, an enormous sum for domestic help. "The bid is $10, he managed weakly. "Going once." "This ain't right," someone shouted. "A white woman working for a savage?" Tahu turned toward the voice, and something in his bearing made the speaker step back. "I offer honest work for honest pay, more than anyone else here has done." "Going twice." Eleanor finally looked directly at her unexpected bidder. Their eyes met across the crowd, and what she saw there wasn't the lust of Garrett or the cruel amusement of the townspeople. It was something else entirely, a steady, measuring gaze that seemed to see past her shame to something deeper. "Sold!" Crawford's gavel came down with finality. The crowd exploded. Shouts of outrage, protests about propriety and the natural order. But Tahu was already walking toward the platform, pulling out a leather pouch. He counted out the first month's payment in gold coins, the clink of metal silencing some of the protests. Eleanor descended from the platform on unsteady legs. Up close, She could see the lines around Tahu's eyes, the gray threading through his hair. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 40 or more. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, meant only for her. "Gather your things. We leave immediately." "Why?" The word escaped before Eleanor could stop it. "Why did you bid for me?" He studied her for a moment. "Because I chose to come," still reeling. Eleanor collected her meager bag. The crowd parted reluctantly as Tahu led her toward a wagon waiting at the edge of the square. She could feel their stares boring into her back, could hear the vicious whispers starting already. The barren woman sold to a Comanche. It would be the talk of the territory. As they reached the wagon, Eleanor hesitated. Behind her lay everything she had known, cruel and cold as it had become. Ahead lay the unknown, in the company of a man whose motives she couldn't fathom. "Second thoughts?" Tahu asked, already checking the horses' harnesses. Eleanor looked back at the crowd one last time. She saw Garrett's furious face, Crawford's relief, the sanctimonious satisfaction of the town's matrons. They had gotten what they wanted. She was removed from their midst, no longer their problem or their shame. "No," she said firmly, climbing into the wagon. "No second thoughts." As Tahu guided the horses out of town, Eleanor kept her back straight and her eyes forward. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cower. Whatever lay ahead, whatever this man intended, it couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. The last thing she'd heard as Cedar Ridge fell away behind them was someone shouting, "You'll regret this, woman. Once a savage gets tired of you, you'll have nowhere to go." But Eleanor was already looking ahead, toward the open prairie and the unknown future that stretched before her. She had been sold for shame. That much was true. But somehow, in the steady presence of the man beside her and the growing distance from her tormentors, she felt the first stirring of something she had thought lost forever. Hope. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically as they rolled across the prairie, leaving Cedar Ridge further behind with each turn. Eleanor sat rigid on the wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stealing glances at the man who had just purchased her future for $10 a month. Joseph Tahu drove in silence, his attention seemingly focused on the rutted trail ahead. But she sensed an awareness in him, a watchfulness that spoke of years living between two worlds. The sun climbed higher, and the morning's humiliation began to feel like something from another lifetime. Out here, with only the vast sky and waving grass as witnesses, Eleanor found her voice again. "Why did you bid for me?" The question hung in the air between them. Tahu didn't answer immediately, guiding the horses around a particularly deep rut before responding. "Does it matter?" "Yes." The word came out more forcefully than she intended. "I need to know what you expect." "I expect help with my children. Nothing more." Eleanor turned to study his profile. "Children?" 6, ages 4 to 14. He glanced at her briefly. "Their mother died last winter. Fever. I'm sorry for your loss." He nodded, accepting the condolence without elaboration. They continued in silence for several minutes before Eleanor gathered the courage to speak again. "You could have hired someone else, someone without my reputation." "What reputation is that?" Heat rose in her cheeks. "You must have heard, in town, what they say about me." "I heard plenty. Doesn't make it worth listening to." Eleanor stared at him, unable to comprehend such easy dismissal of what had defined her existence for 2 years. "They say I'm barren, that I can't give children, that I'm worthless as a woman." Tahu pulled the horses to a stop and turned to face her fully for the first time since leaving town. His dark eyes held no pity, no judgment, only a frank assessment that made her want to both hide and stand taller. "Can you cook?" Yes." "Can you mend clothes, help with lessons, tend sick children?" "Yes, but—" "Then you're not worthless." He clicked to the horses, and they resumed their journey. "The rest is noise." Eleanor sat in stunned silence, trying to process this simple logic that cut through years of shame like a sharp blade through tangled rope. But your children need a mother, a real mother, one who can— My children need someone who will care for them, who will see them as more than half-breeds and treat them with kindness. His jaw tightened. That's harder to find than you might think. Understanding dawned. The town, they're not kind to your family. My wife was white, like you. When she married me, they called her worse names than they call you. A bitter smile touched his lips. At least you had the excuse of God's will. Sarah chose her shame willingly. She must have loved you very much. She loved our children more. The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakable. Even when the town turned its back on her, even when her own family disowned her, she never regretted it. They crested a small rise, and Eleanor saw a homestead in the distance, a solid cabin with a barn and several outbuildings, smoke rising from the chimney. It looked well-maintained, prosperous even. Not what she had expected. Mr. Tahu, Joseph, or just Tahu, the children call me Pa. Joseph. The name felt foreign on her tongue. Why me? You still haven't truly answered. There must have been others who would work for less. Who would— I was in town last month. Saw you at the well. He kept his eyes on the trail. Saw how they treated you, how you held your head up anyway. Eleanor remembered that day. The children's cruel songs, the women's turned backs. She had thought herself alone in her humiliation. You saw strength where everyone else saw shame. He continued, My children have enough people looking at them like they're less than human. They don't need another. And you think I won't, because I know what it feels like? I think you'll see them as children first. The rest, we'll figure out. As they drew closer to the homestead, Eleanor could make out figures on the porch, children of various ages. Watching their approach, her stomach knotted with fresh anxiety. What have you told them about me? The truth, that I've hired someone to help with the house and their education, that you're a widow who needs work. Nothing else? He gave her a sharp look. What else matters? Eleanor had no answer for that. In town, everything else had mattered. Her barrenness, her failure as a wife, her unsuitability for remarriage. Here, apparently, those defining shames were merely background noise. They may not accept me, she warned. Children can be cruel. Yes, he agreed. They learned it from adults, but they can also learn differently. The wagon rolled into the yard, and the children straightened like soldiers under inspection. Eleanor counted 6, as promised, 3 boys and 3 girls, ranging from a small boy who couldn't be more than 4 to a girl on the cusp of womanhood. They all bore their father's dark hair and strong features, but softened with their mother's influence. Beautiful children, she thought, and felt an unexpected pang that had nothing to do with her own emptiness. Tahu helped her down from the wagon, and she stood before her new charges, trying not to fidget under their scrutiny. The oldest girl stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. You're the woman from town, not a question. Yes, my name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm Mary. These are my brothers and sisters. She indicated each in turn. James, Samuel, Anna, Ruth, and little Thomas. Eleanor's breath caught at the youngest boy's name. Such a common name, but hearing it still sent a spike of pain through her chest. The boy, oblivious to her reaction, peered at her from behind Mary's skirts. Can you make berry pie? He asked solemnly. Despite everything, Eleanor found herself smiling. I can— Is that important? Mom made the best berry pie. Anna, perhaps 8, informed her, Nobody else makes it right. Well, Eleanor said carefully, perhaps you can teach me how she made it. The children exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Mary nodded. Come inside. I'll show you where things are. As Eleanor followed the children into the house, she caught Tahu watching her with something that might have been approval. When their eyes met, he nodded once before turning to tend the horses. The house was larger than it appeared from outside, well-built and clean, but showing signs of motherless disorder. Children's belongings scattered on surfaces, dishes not quite properly washed, a fine layer of dust on the furniture. Eleanor felt a familiar stirring, the need to create order, to nurture, to make a home.
"Pa tries,"
Mary said, noticing her assessment.
"but he doesn't know about house things, and I do my best, but—"
"You're 14, Eleanor finished gently.
"You shouldn't have to carry it all."
Something in Mary's face shifted, a crack in her careful composure.
"Ma said I was the woman of the house now, before she—"
"Your mother was preparing you to be strong, but strong doesn't mean alone." Mary's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "They say things in town, about Pa, about us. They'll say things about you too, for coming here." Eleanor looked at this too young girl trying so hard to be adult, thought of the 5 other children waiting to see if this stranger would be kind, thought of the man who had seen her strength when everyone else saw only her shame.
"Let them talk,"
she said firmly.
"I've heard worse. Now, why don't you show me your mother's recipe box? If I'm going to learn to make berry pie properly, we'd best start soon." For the first time, Mary smiled, a real smile that transformed her serious face. "Ma kept it in the pantry. She had very particular ideas about pie crust."
As Eleanor followed Mary deeper into the house, listening to the girl's careful instructions and the other children's interjected comments, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not quite belonging, that would take time, but the possibility of it, the potential for purpose beyond her body's failures. Through the kitchen window, she could see Tahu unhitching the horses, his movement steady and sure. He had chosen her, this strange, quiet man. Not for pity, not for charity, but because he had seen in her what she had stopped seeing in herself. Worth beyond her womb, strength beyond her shame, a future beyond the narrow definitions of a woman's value. For the first time since Thomas's death, Eleanor Whitmore felt the stirring of something that might, eventually, grow into hope. The acrid smell of burnt bread filled the kitchen as Eleanor frantically pulled the smoking loaf from the oven, her 3rd day at the Tahu homestead. And already she had managed to ruin breakfast. The children sat around the large wooden table, watching with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed amusement.
"Ma always said you have to watch the oven close,"
Anna offered helpfully.
"It runs hot on the left side."
Eleanor set the blackened bread on the counter, fighting back tears of frustration. Everything here was different. The temperamental stove, the way supplies were organized, even the water that had to be hauled from the well had a different taste. She felt clumsy and incompetent, her hands seeming to betray her at every turn.
"It's all right,"
Mary said quickly, already moving to salvage what she could. "We can cut off the burnt parts, and there's leftover cornbread from yesterday." But little Thomas's face crumpled.
"I wanted fresh bread. Ma always made fresh bread."
"Well, I'm not your ma." The words escaped before Eleanor could stop them, sharp and bitter. The kitchen fell silent. Thomas's eyes filled with tears, and he fled from the table. Eleanor stood frozen, horrified at her outburst. These children had lost their mother only months ago, and here she was, snapping at them over bread. "I'll go after him," James, the 2nd eldest at 12, said quietly. He gave Eleanor a look that was neither accusing nor forgiving, just tired, too tired for a boy his age. After the children dispersed, to chores, to comfort Thomas, to anywhere but near her, Eleanor sank into a chair and buried her face in her hands. What was she doing here? She who had failed at the most basic function of womanhood, who couldn't even manage a simple breakfast without disaster. The stove takes getting used to. She looked up to find Tahu in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He must have heard everything from the barn.
I'm sorry. I shouldn't have spoken to Thomas that way.
You're trying too hard. He moved into the kitchen, pouring himself coffee from the pot that, at least, she hadn't managed to ruin.
They don't need perfection. They need patience.
I don't know how to do this. The admission came out raw. In town, I kept house for 2. Everything here is different, larger, more complex. And the children, they're grieving, and I'm a poor substitute for what they've lost. Tahu sat across from her, his dark eyes steady. Sarah burned plenty of meals when we first married, cried over everyone. A faint smile touched his lips. She was a town girl, like you, didn't know anything about managing a homestead. But she learned. With time and many burnt loaves. He gestured to the failed bread. The children don't expect you to be her. They just need to know you won't leave. Eleanor thought of the auction platform, of the desperation that had driven her here.
Where would I go? That's not the same as choosing to stay.
Before she could respond, small footsteps padded into the kitchen. Thomas peered around the doorframe, his face splotchy from crying. James stood behind him, hand on his little brother's shoulder.
I'm sorry I yelled, Thomas whispered.
Eleanor's heart clenched.
Oh, sweetheart, no.
I'm the one who should apologize.
I was frustrated with myself, not you, and I spoke unkindly.
The boy edged closer. Could we maybe make new bread together? I know how Ma did it.
I would like that very much.
As Thomas climbed onto a stool beside her, chattering about his mother's technique, Eleanor caught Tahu's eye. He nodded once before heading back outside, leaving her to navigate this small reconciliation. The day continued with its series of minor catastrophes. Eleanor knocked over the water bucket, soaking the kitchen floor. She added too much soap to the wash, creating a foam mountain that delighted the younger children but meant everything had to be rinsed 3 times. When she attempted to help Samuel with his arithmetic, she discovered the teaching methods had changed since her own schooling, leaving both of them frustrated. But there were small victories too. Ruth, age 6, shyly showed her a doll with a torn dress, and Eleanor's fingers remembered the careful stitches her mother had taught her. Anna helped her understand the quirks of the stove, and by dinner, she managed a passable stew that everyone ate without complaint. As evening fell, Eleanor stepped onto the porch, exhausted. The vast prairie stretched before her, so different from the confined streets of Cedar Ridge. She could hear the children inside, Mary reading to the younger ones, the boys discussing plans for tomorrow's chores. Overwhelming? She turned to find Mary beside her, arms wrapped around herself against the cooling air.
Yes,
Eleanor admitted.
I feel like I'm failing at every turn.
Ma said that too, in the beginning. Mary's voice was soft.
I was just a baby then,
but she told me stories. How she had to learn everything, cooking on a wood stove, hauling water, making soap, dealing with Pa's silences. His silences? A small smile flickered across Mary's face. Pa doesn't talk much. Ma said it took her months to realize that he shows love through actions, not words. The way he fixed things before she even asked. How he'd bring her wildflowers without saying why. Eleanor thought of how Tahu had appeared in the kitchen that morning, offering understanding rather than criticism. How he'd sent Thomas back to her with gentle encouragement. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman.
She was.
Mary's voice wavered. But she was also scared sometimes. Overwhelmed. Human. The girl looked at Eleanor directly. We don't need another Ma. We just need someone who won't give up on us.
I'm not sure I know how to be what you need. Maybe you could start by just being yourself?
Mary suggested. The woman who knows how to mend dolls and doesn't get angry when Thomas cries. That might be enough. After Mary went inside, Eleanor remained on the porch, watching the stars emerge. She thought of her cabin in Cedar Ridge, of the sampler on the wall declaring children a heritage from the Lord. Here, she was surrounded by children who weren't hers, would never be hers in the way society deemed important. Yet they needed her, not her womb, not her ability to produce heirs, but her patience, her care, her simple presence. When she finally went inside, she found the kitchen cleaned, the dishes washed and put away. A note in Mary's careful script lay on the table. "Thank you for trying. Tomorrow will be easier." Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs to her small room under the eaves. Through the thin walls, she could hear the house settling for the night. Samuel mumbling in his sleep, Ruth's soft snoring, Mary's footsteps as she checked on the younger ones. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman looking back still bore the marks of grief and hardship. But something had shifted. The desperation had faded, replaced by exhaustion that spoke of effort rather than despair. She thought of Tahu's words. "Worth is not in chores or mistakes. It is in your heart." She had thought it platitude at the time, but now, after a day of failures and small recoveries, she began to understand. Her worth wasn't in perfection. It wasn't in replacing Sarah or becoming an instant mother. It was in showing up tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, in learning the stove's quirks and Thomas's fears and Mary's responsibilities, in choosing to stay not because she had nowhere else to go, but because these 6 children and their silent father were beginning to feel like somewhere she wanted to be. Eleanor blew out her candle and lay in the narrow bed, listening to the night sounds of her new home. Tomorrow, she would try again. The bread might burn, the water might spill, the children might cry, but she would be here, learning how to build a different kind of family, one small, imperfect step at a time. For the first time in years, she fell asleep not cataloging her failures, but planning tomorrow's possibilities. The general store in Cedar Ridge had always been a place of casual cruelty for Eleanor, but walking through its doors with the Tahu children felt like entering a den of wolves. She had been at the homestead for 3 weeks now, and this was their first trip to town for supplies. The younger children pressed close to her skirts while Mary walked with rigid dignity, already armor-plated against what was to come. Well, Mrs. Harrington's voice cut through the store's musty air. "If it isn't the barren woman, playing mother to half-breeds." Eleanor's hand found Ruth's shoulder, steadying them both. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrington. We're here for supplies." "I'm sure you are." The woman's eyes glittered with malicious pleasure. "Though I can't imagine what possessed you. Eleanor, bad enough you couldn't give poor Thomas children, but to parade around with these." "These children," Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying a strength she didn't know she possessed, "are here to help me shop, if you'll excuse us." She guided the children toward the counter, but the whispers followed them like persistent flies. "Shameful," someone muttered. "Those poor creatures, neither white nor Indian, and now with a barren woman pretending to mother them." Eleanor felt Anna's hand slip into hers, trembling slightly. Samuel's jaw was clenched, his 12-year-old pride warring with hurt. Even little Thomas understood enough to press against Mary's side, seeking comfort. Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, served them with obvious reluctance, handling their money as if it might contaminate him. Eleanor kept her voice pleasant as she requested flour, sugar, and other necessities, though inside she burned with fury at the treatment these children endured. They were almost finished when Jake Sullivan sauntered over, whiskey already on his breath despite the early hour. "Hey there, Mary," he drawled, his eyes roving over the 14-year-old in a way that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Growing up pretty, just like your ma. Maybe in a year or 2, you'll be looking for a husband. Not many options for a girl like you. But I might—" "Step away from her." Eleanor's voice was low, dangerous. She moved between Sullivan and Mary, her entire body vibrating with protective rage. Sullivan laughed. "What are you gonna do, barren woman? You got no authority here, no husband, no children of your own. Just playing house with a savage's brood. I said step away. Something in Eleanor's face must have warned him, because Sullivan took a half step back, but his sneer remained. Protective of your borrowed children. Ain't you? Pathetic. A dried-up woman clinging to another woman's leavings. The words hit their mark. They always did. But then Eleanor felt a warm presence at her back. Mary had stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with her. Mrs. Whitmore is with us, Mary said, her young voice carrying surprising authority. And you'll speak to her with respect, or my father will hear of it. The threat of Tahu's involvement sobered Sullivan slightly. Everyone knew the quiet Comanche was not a man to cross. He spat on the floor near their feet before shambling away, muttering about uppity half-breeds and their barren nursemaid. Eleanor's hands shook as she gathered their purchases. The children were silent as they loaded the wagon, their earlier chatter extinguished. It wasn't until they were well out of town that anyone spoke. Thank you, Eleanor said quietly to Mary, for standing up for me. Mary kept her eyes on the road ahead. You stood up for me first. They're horrible people, Anna burst out, her 8-year-old indignation finally finding voice. Why are they so mean? Eleanor considered her words carefully. Sometimes people are cruel because they're afraid of what they don't understand, or because making others feel small makes them feel bigger. Ma used to say they were just ignorant, Samuel added. But it still hurt her. We could tell. Your mother was a brave woman, Eleanor said. It takes courage to live according to your heart when the world tells you you're wrong. Is that why you came to us? Ruth asked in her soft voice. Because you're brave too? Eleanor almost laughed at the idea. Brave? She had come because she had no other choice, because the auction platform had been her last resort. But looking at these children, beautiful, resilient, caught between two worlds and welcome in neither, she felt something fierce rise in her chest. I came because your father offered me work, she said honestly. But I stay because... She paused, searching for words. Because you're teaching me that family isn't always about blood or birth. Sometimes it's about choosing to care for each other, even when it's hard. Thomas piped up from his corner of the wagon. Does that mean you're our family now? The question hung in the air. Eleanor caught Mary's eye in the wagon's mirror, saw the guarded hope there. I'd like to be, Eleanor said softly. If you'll have me. Even though people say mean things, Anna asked. Especially then, that's when family matters most. The rest of the ride passed in companionable silence, each of them processing the morning's ugliness and Eleanor's declaration. As the homestead came into view, Eleanor saw Tahu emerge from the barn, alerted by the sound of the wagon. His dark eyes swept over them, taking in their subdued demeanor and the protective way they clustered around Eleanor. Trouble in town? He asked as he helped unload supplies. Nothing we couldn't handle, Mary said with a small smile at Eleanor. We took care of each other. Tahu's gaze found Eleanor's, and something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. He nodded once before carrying the flour sack inside. That evening, as Eleanor tucked Ruth into bed, the little girl caught her hand. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm glad you're here, even if mean people say bad things. So am I, sweetheart, Eleanor whispered, smoothing the child's hair. So am I. Later, sitting by the fire mending Samuel's torn shirt, Eleanor reflected on the day. The town's cruelty had been expected, but the children's defense of her had not. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, between burnt bread and patient teaching, between tears and laughter, they had begun to claim each other. Mary appeared in the doorway. I put Thomas to bed. He wanted me to tell you he loves you. She paused, then added quietly, We all do, you know, maybe not the same as Ma, but differently, our own way. Eleanor's vision blurred with unshed tears. I love you all too, very much.
Good. Mary's smile was like sunrise. Then it doesn't matter what anyone in town says. We know the truth.
As Mary headed to bed, Eleanor continued her mending, each stitch securing more than just fabric. She thought of the women at the well who had shunned her, of Jake Sullivan's crude insinuations, of all the voices that had told her she was worthless without children of her own. They were wrong, here in this house, with these 6 children who weren't hers by birth but were becoming hers by choice. Eleanor had found something the town's narrow definitions could never encompass. Not a replacement for what she couldn't have, but something entirely its own. Messy, challenging, beautiful, and real. The fire crackled softly as she worked, and through the window, stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, Eleanor Whitmore sat in a house full of sleeping children who had claimed her as family, and felt herself becoming whole in ways she had never imagined possible. The fever came in the night, swift and merciless. Eleanor woke to the sound of Ruth's whimpering, and when she touched the child's forehead, the heat nearly burned her hand. 6 years old and suddenly so fragile, Ruth's small body shook with chills even as sweat soaked through her nightgown.
Mary!
Eleanor called urgently, already lifting Ruth into her arms.
Bring cool water and cloths, quickly!
The house stirred to life despite the late hour. Mary appeared with the requested items while James stoked the fire and Samuel corralled the younger children, keeping them from crowding the sick room. Through it all, Eleanor's mind raced with terrible clarity. Tahu had ridden to the county seat that morning on business, not expected back for 2 days. The nearest doctor was in Cedar Ridge, and even if she could fetch him, Eleanor knew with sinking certainty that he wouldn't come for a half-breed child.
What do we do?
Mary's voice was steady, but Eleanor could see the fear in her eyes. They had already lost their mother to fever.
We fight,
Eleanor said firmly, though her own heart hammered with terror.
Your mother fought for each of you when you were sick. Now we fight for Ruth.
The night blurred into a battle against the rising fever. Eleanor bathed Ruth's burning skin with cool cloths, spooned willow bark tea between her cracked lips, and held her through the violent shaking. The child's breathing grew labored, rattling in her small chest, and Eleanor found herself praying with desperate fervor, not the formal prayers of church, but raw pleas from a heart that had already lost too much.
Please,
she whispered against Ruth's damp hair.
Please don't take her. These children have suffered enough. Please.
Mary worked beside her tirelessly, brewing medicines from her mother's carefully noted recipes.
Ma always said fever was the body fighting,
she murmured, more to comfort herself than anything.
That we had to help it fight, not against it. Your mother was wise,
Eleanor managed, though privately she wondered if wisdom would be enough against whatever illness had taken hold. Dawn came without improvement. Ruth's fever climbed higher, and she began to mumble incoherently, calling for her mother. Each cry was a knife to Eleanor's heart. She had failed to give Thomas children, and now she would fail to save this child who had begun to feel like her own. "I'll ride for the doctor," James announced, already reaching for his coat.
"He won't come," Samuel said bitterly. "Not for us."
"Then I'll make him come."
"No."
Eleanor's voice cut through their argument.
"We stay together. All of us."
She looked at each child in turn. Ruth needs to feel us here, fighting for her. That matters more than a doctor who sees her as less than human. The second night was worse. Ruth's fever spiked dangerously high, and her breathing became shallow, labored. Eleanor had moved beyond exhaustion into a state of fierce determination. She would not lose this child, not on her watch. "Sing to her," Anna suggested quietly.
"Ma always sang when we were sick."
Eleanor's throat was raw from lack of sleep, but she began the lullabies her own mother had sung, simple melodies about stars and dreams and safety. The other children joined in, their voices creating a protective circle around their sister. It was then, in that darkest hour before dawn, that Ruth's fever finally broke. Eleanor felt it happen, the sudden cooling of skin, the easier breathing, the relaxation of muscles that had been clenched in battle. She looked up to find 6 pairs of eyes watching her with something like awe. "Is she—" Mary couldn't finish the question. "The fever's broken," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "She's going to be all right." The children erupted in quiet celebration, mindful of their sleeping sister. Thomas threw his arms around Eleanor's waist, burying his face in her skirts. "You saved her," he whispered, "just like a real mama would." Eleanor's breath caught. She looked down at Ruth, peaceful now in natural sleep. Then at the children surrounding her, these beautiful, resilient souls who had somehow become hers without benefit of birth or blood. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Ruth's voice was barely a whisper, but her eyes were clear, focused. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe." Ruth's small hand found Eleanor's, gripping with surprising strength. "Mama," she breathed, and closed her eyes again in healing sleep. The word hung in the air like a blessing. Eleanor looked up to find Mary crying silently, the tears she had held back for 2 days finally falling. "She called you Mama," Anna said wonderingly. "Is that all right?" Eleanor asked, looking at each child. These weren't hers to claim. And yet— "Ma's gone," Samuel said simply. "But you're here. You stayed. You fought for Ruth when nobody else would have." "The whole town thinks we're not worth saving," James added quietly. "But you nearly killed yourself trying to save her." Mary spoke last, her voice thick with emotion. "Ma would want us to have someone who loves us like that, who sees us as worth fighting for." When Tahu returned that evening, travel-weary and dust-covered, he found a transformed household. Ruth was sitting up in bed, weak but improving, surrounded by her siblings. Eleanor dozed in the chair beside her, holding the child's hand even in sleep. "Papa!" Ruth's cry was weak but joyful. "Mrs. Whitmore saved me. The fever came, and she stayed with me all night and all day and all night again. She's my mama now. Is that okay?" Tahu's dark eyes moved from his daughter to Eleanor, who had awakened at his arrival. Something profound passed between them, understanding, gratitude, and perhaps something deeper. "If that's what you want," he told Ruth gently. "And if Mrs. Whitmore agrees." "The children have honored me with their trust," Eleanor said quietly. "I would be honored to be whatever they need me to be." Later, after the children were settled and Ruth sleeping peacefully, Tahu found Eleanor on the porch, finally allowing herself to feel the exhaustion of the past 2 days. "Mary told me everything," he said, standing beside her in the darkness. "How you refused to leave Ruth's side, how you fought for her. Any mother would have done the same." "Yes," he agreed. "Any mother would have." The weight of his words settled over her like a blessing. Not stepmother, not caretaker, not the barren woman playing house. Mother. "They're afraid to love me," Eleanor said softly. "Afraid I'll leave like their mother did, even though she didn't choose to go." "Are you going to leave?" Eleanor thought of Cedar Ridge, of the auction platform, of all the voices that had told her she was worthless without children of her own. Then she thought of 6 faces watching her with trust and growing love, of Ruth's small hand in hers, of being called Mama by a child she had helped save. "No," she said firmly. "I'm never going to leave. They're my children now, in every way that matters." Tahu nodded, satisfied. "Then you've given them what I hired you to give. Not just care, but permanence. Not just help, but heart." As he went inside, Eleanor remained on the porch, looking up at the stars. She thought of Thomas, her late husband, and somehow knew he would understand. The children she couldn't give him had been replaced by 6 who needed her desperately, who had claimed her as their own through trial and trust. The night wind carried the scent of prairie grass and possibility. Inside the house, her children slept safely, including one little girl who had looked death in the face and chosen to stay, anchored by a love that transcended blood and birth. Eleanor Whitmore, once deemed barren and worthless, had become what she never thought possible, a mother, tried by fire and proven true. And in that becoming, she had finally found herself. Spring arrived on the prairie like a promise kept, painting the grasslands with wildflowers and filling the air with the scent of new beginnings. Eleanor stood in the garden she had planted with the children, watching green shoots push through the dark soil. 6 months had passed since the auction platform, since the day her life had taken an unexpected turn toward grace. "Mama, look!" Thomas ran toward her, his small hands cupped around something precious. "The first strawberry!" Eleanor knelt to examine his treasure, a tiny red berry that represented so much more than fruit. They had planted the strawberry patch together on a cold March day, the children chattering about their mother's jam while Eleanor learned their rhythms and preferences. Now, as Thomas placed the berry in her palm with reverent care, she felt the full weight of transformation. "Should we save it for pie?" she asked, though she knew his answer. "No, you eat it," he said solemnly. "The first one is always for Mama." She ate the sun-warmed berry, its sweetness bringing tears to her eyes. Through the kitchen window, she could see Mary teaching Anna to braid bread, their movements synchronized through patient practice. James and Samuel worked with their father in the barn, their voices carrying on the morning air. Ruth, fully recovered and vibrant with health, helped hang laundry while singing the songs Eleanor had taught her during those fever-dark nights. This was family, not the one she had dreamed of in her early marriage, not the one defined by blood and birth, but something altogether more precious because it had been chosen, fought for, earned through burnt bread and sleepless nights and fierce love. "Mrs. Whitmore." The harsh voice shattered the morning's peace. Eleanor turned to see a group from town approaching, Mrs. Harrington, Mrs. Fletcher, and several others, their faces pinched with disapproval. Behind them, incongruously, rode Reverend Morrison. Eleanor's stomach tightened, but she stood straight, her hand finding Thomas's shoulder. "Good morning," she said evenly. "There's nothing good about it, Mrs. Harrington snapped. "We've come to put an end to this arrangement." "I wasn't aware my employment was any concern of yours." "Employment, Mrs. Fletcher's laugh was harsh. "Is that what you call living in sin with a savage, corrupting innocent children?" Eleanor felt Thomas press against her side, trembling. Before she could respond, Tahu emerged from the barn, James and Samuel flanking him. His presence changed the atmosphere, made the women step back slightly. "State your business," he said quietly. Reverend Morrison cleared his throat. "We've come out of Christian concern. Mr. Tahu, it's not proper. A woman living here without formal arrangements. And these children, growing up without proper spiritual guidance." "My children receive all the guidance they need." Tahu interrupted. "From a barren woman, Mrs. Harrington's voice dripped venom. "A woman who couldn't give her own husband children, now pretending to mother yours. It's an abomination." Eleanor felt each word like a physical blow, the old shame rising. But then Ruth's voice rang out clear and strong. "She is our mother. She saved me when I was sick. She teaches us and loves us and—" "Hush, child," Mrs. Fletcher commanded. "You don't understand. This woman is using you, filling the empty place inside her with children that aren't hers, can never be hers." "Enough." Tahu's voice was steel. "You've said your piece. Now leave." But Reverend Morrison raised his hand. "I've come with a proposition. Mrs. Whitmore could return to town, to proper society. The church has arranged a position for her in the orphanage. Useful work, helping children who truly need—" "No," Eleanor's voice cut through his words. No, I won't leave. Think carefully, the Reverend warned. Your reputation, your eternal soul. My soul is my own concern. And my reputation? Eleanor laughed, surprising herself with the sound. You destroyed that long ago with your whispers and judgment. But here's what you didn't understand. I don't need your approval anymore. She felt the children gathering around her, a protective circle. Mary stood at her right shoulder. Ruth pressed against her left side, the boys forming a wall of young defiance. These are my children, Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. Not by birth, but by choice, by love, by every night I've sat with them through nightmares, every meal we've shared, every lesson taught and learned. You see emptiness where I see abundance. You see shame where I see purpose. Pretty words. Mrs., Harrington sneered. But you're still... Still what? Barren? Eleanor spoke the word that had defined her for so long, robbing it of its power. Yes, I couldn't give my husband children, but I can give these children a mother's love. I can give them someone who sees their worth when the world tells them they're worthless. Someone who stays. Tahu moved to stand beside her, and Eleanor felt the solid presence of his support. Then, to her amazement, he spoke. Eleanor Whitmore came to this house as an employee. She stays as family, as the woman my children call mother, as the woman I intend to marry, if she'll have me. The words hung in the air like thunder. Eleanor turned to stare at him, seeing in his dark eyes not pity or convenience, but something deeper, understanding, respect, love. Marry, Reverend Morrison sputtered. The sanctity of marriage is about commitment, Tahu finished. About choosing to build a life together, about love. All things you preach but don't practice. He reached into his pocket and drew out something that caught the morning light, a necklace of silver and turquoise, worn smooth with age. Sarah's necklace, Eleanor realized, the one she had seen in the portrait above the mantel. This belonged to my wife, Tahu said, his voice gentle now, speaking only to Eleanor. She wore it as a symbol of choosing her own path, of building a family beyond what others thought possible. I would be honored if you would wear it, if you would choose us as we choose you. Eleanor's hands trembled as she took the necklace. Around her, the children held their breath, waiting. Even the group from town had fallen silent, witnesses to something beyond their narrow understanding. Yes, Eleanor said simply. Yes, I choose you, all of you. As Tahu fastened the necklace around her throat, Thomas whooped with joy, and suddenly all the children were talking at once, laughing, crying, celebrating. Through their noise, Eleanor heard Mrs. Harrington's sharp voice. You'll regret this. You're throwing away your last chance at respectability. No, Eleanor said, turning to face them one final time. I'm embracing my first chance at real happiness, at family, at love that doesn't measure worth by what my body can or cannot do. The town will shun you completely now, Mrs. Fletcher warned. Eleanor looked at her family, her chosen, beloved, perfect family, and smiled. Let them. I have everything I need right here. The delegation from town left in scandalized defeat, Reverend Morrison muttering about sin and salvations lost. But Eleanor barely noticed their departure. She was surrounded by her children, all talking at once about wedding plans and celebrations, and whether this meant Thomas could call Tahu Papa now instead of just Pa. Some later. As the excitement settled and the children dispersed to share the news with the animals, Ruth's idea. Eleanor and Tahu stood together in the garden where the strawberries grew. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. Propose. I mean, not for them. I didn't do it for them. His hand found hers, work roughened and steady. Sarah saw something in me worth choosing, worth fighting for. I see the same in you. We've both learned that family isn't always what others expect. Eleanor touched the necklace at her throat, warm from the sun. I came here broken, believing I was worthless. Your children healed me. You healed me. We healed each other, he corrected. That's what family does. As spring afternoon stretched golden across the prairie, Eleanor stood in her garden surrounded by the sound of children's laughter. Wearing the necklace of a woman who had blazed this trail before her, she had been sold for shame on that auction platform, reduced to her failures and found wanting. But here, in this place of second chances and chosen love, she had discovered her true worth. Not as a woman who could bear children, but as a mother who could raise them. Not as someone defined by her body's limitations, but by her heart's infinite capacity for love. She had been chosen not despite her supposed flaws, but because of her strength, her persistence, her ability to see beyond society's cruel definitions to the truth of what makes a family. The children called to her from the house, something about cookies and wedding dresses and whether Ruth could carry flowers. Eleanor smiled, squeezed Tahu's hand once more, and walked toward her future. Behind her, the strawberry plants grew strong in the prairie soil, proof that the most beautiful things often bloom in unexpected places, nurtured by love that refuses to be bound by narrow definitions of worth. She had been sold for shame, yes, but she had been chosen for love. And in that choosing, both given and received, Eleanor Whitmore had finally come home.